Hello, I'm Alan Critchley, an independent social worker writing Safeguarding Adult Reviews for Kent, and I'm going to talk to you about Elias. Elias was age 69 when he died. He was found unresponsive in his home on the 16th of May 2023 and subsequently died in hospital in June 23. His death was unexpected on the day it occurred. It had been shortly after he'd eaten his lunch and spoken to his brother and sister-in-law. It was determined that he'd died from natural causes. The Safeguarding Adult Review was commissioned because it was thought that agencies could have worked better to safeguard Elias. He was diabetic, with poorly managed medication and a range of other physical and mental ill health issues. The methodology used for this was day review. So those who had known Elias and or their managers met for a facilitated day to look at whether anything might have been different in Elias's care, especially if agencies had worked together more closely. Elias was known to agencies for many years for his health and social care needs. He'd had several hospital admissions and unplanned discharges, and would also decline hospital admissions when it was considered by others that going to hospital was in his best interests. He'd had a history of suicidal ideation and had said that he would overdose on insulin. Additionally, he would display behavioural issues and could become verbally aggressive to those working with him. Those who worked with him knew very little about his past. He was said to be born in British Guiana, as it was then known, before moving to the UK at the age of 8. The author of this review, me, have spoken to Elias's brother and his sister-in-law. They confirmed that he'd never married, but he had had girlfriends. He'd worked as a painter and decorator, and he'd also been a plasterer. As his health had declined, he'd been unable to work in the years up to his death. They described how he'd found his diabetes difficult to manage over the years, and that once he'd lost some toes in 2021, things became more difficult for him. They felt very strongly that he was unable to manage his insulin levels and that he really needed more support than he was getting. This, they thought, would have been particularly helpful in the early stages before his patterns became entrenched. His brother and sister-in-law said that services working with Elias had had their contact details and that they would like to have had more involvement in Elias's care than they did have. To do this would have necessitated consent from Elias, and he didn't give that. Elias mentioned to those working with him that his dad had described him as slow. It's possible that he was neurodivergent, but this was never explored with him. Given his age and degree of independence, it's difficult to see what might have been different, even if neurodivergence had been identified. He would also, over the years, have developed strategies to cope with any sort of difference. Undoing or reviewing those strategies might have been difficult and counterproductive for Elias. Whilst Elias was known to be verbally abusive to some people, he was described quite fondly at the review day. One attendee said, "Most of us that worked with him loved him, even when he was ranting." Others described him in a similar way, saying that once someone was listening to him, he'd usually calm down. Threats made by Elias were concerning. It's outside the timeline of this review, but he'd been arrested on 20 occasions between 2005 and 2017. Information from the Metropolitan Police also confirmed that there was an injunction not to contact a London hospital and that he'd been subject to harassment orders covering Buckingham Palace, the Metropolitan Police and the House of Commons. Arrests for Elias were in relation to offences of wasting police time, malicious communications, including bomb hoaxes and threats to kill. The target of these threats were hospitals, banks and the police. He was known as a man with a strong sense of justice, and he became angry when he felt that he had been wronged, for example, over whether or not he was responsible for funding certain services that he received. Another example given was that he had been admitted to hospital via ambulance. When he was discharged, he expected to be taken home by ambulance, and he was unhappy with the suggestion that he might have to pay for a taxi. When such issues were unpicked and explained to him, he usually calmed down. It was also said that he had respect for those in uniforms, whether they were carers or members of the blue light services. Elias had been diagnosed with delusional disorder in 2012. His medical records also showed mania from the same time and paranoid states from 2010. Over the years, this diagnosis had been lost from his records, and he wasn't treated for disorder or as though he had the disorder. The review was informed that delusional disorder is very hard to treat, prognosis is poor, and treatment is ineffective. Given that the prognosis is poor, it's likely that the delusional disorder remained, but that Elias was not treated for it. Having said that, his symptoms do appear to have reduced over the years. Otherwise, the disorder would have been apparent in Elias's presentation. It was also confirmed at the review that Elias had requested himself, in 2021, that the diagnosis of delusional disorder should be removed from his medical record, and it was. Elias's physical ill health included a grade 2 pressure ulcer, high blood pressure, diabetes, swollen feet, and he was doubly incontinent and awaiting a hip replacement. Safeguarding issues were raised in January and April 23 from CCAM, the ambulance service, and the hospital respectively, with regard to potential self-neglect and concerns around his behaviour. On both occasions, adult social care made referrals to support Elias, and concerns were closed because appropriate mitigating actions were put in place. Now, the recommendations from this review, and there are 4 of them. The first one: where there is evidence of a continuing pattern of making unwise decisions that presents repeated significant risks, a mental capacity assessment should be completed, following, where necessary, by an assessment of executive functioning. This should always be documented. Recommendation 2. Where there are threats of violence made to agency staff and past history gives concern that these threats could be carried out, that a risk assessment is undertaken and agreed on a multi-agency basis. This should be done through the multi-agency forum most appropriate to the person concerned. Recommendation 3 is about communication, including where there are arranged services, and communication should always be clear, accessible, and person-centred. In this instance, we made this recommendation because Elias didn't always understand what people were asking him to do, so it was about communicating with him and involving him in the plans. Recommendation 4. When working with complexities and increasing levels of risk, as indicated by the increasing hospital admissions by Elias, this should enact and trigger agencies to meet, involving where possible the person concerned and those who wish to be present, enabled through information sharing agreements, so that agencies and the person all meet together to talk about the admissions, the reasons for the admissions, how long someone is likely to stay in hospital, and what the purpose will be. Many thanks for listening.